Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go! So just now I was having dinner with a few co-workers at a Chipotle, Mexican-style chain restaurant. And we sat down at one of the high tables and began to eat and converse. We were seated for no more than 5 minutes before we were approached by a couple. They stand there for a second before the woman tells us to move because this was their spot, and they always sat there, and so on. Anyways, after the initial shock, I looked at the woman and said, "Sorry, no, we just started eating. However, you can have it when we finish up." The look on this lady's face was pure gold. She had her eyes squinted and mouth open and replied,
"Are you kidding me? My boyfriend and I have been coming here every weekend for years, and we always sit here, so you need to move now."
At this point, people are starting to stare and it's getting quite awkward. And the whole time, her boyfriend is watching some game on his phone, not paying any attention. Finally, she walks away. Okay, cool, we're done, right? Nope. She cuts the entire line and demands to speak with the manager. After a few minutes, the manager walks out and speaks with the lady. She begins to tell him how rude we were for not letting them have their seat, and how we should be forced to move so they can sit in their spot and enjoy their food. The manager just stares at her for a moment before telling her that there is nothing he can do. I mean, we're paying customers too, right? So she walks back over to our table. Mind you, it's been about 10 minutes and we've hardly touched our food. She demands us to move right now. My other coworker, who is the definition of a non-confrontational, says, "Maybe we should just move so they can sit down." I replied, "Absolutely not." And the lady yells, "Screw you," to all of us, and then my other coworker stood up and yelled, "Leave us alone." The manager walks over and asks her and her boyfriend to leave because they are causing a scene. She refused, so he told her he was going to call the police. Well, he did. And about 15 minutes later, 2 police cars rolled up. The police walk in and the manager begins to talk. He explains what's going on, and then the police ask the lady to step outside to find out what's going on. She says no, and then things get weird. They walk over to her and she finally listens, and all go outside. While outside, she starts to yell at the officers. I don't know what she's saying. And the cops move closer to the lady and she then slaps one of the officers in the neck and then proceeds to get handcuffed and placed in the back of a police car. Once they leave, the manager approaches us and profusely apologizes and says he's never seen anything like this in his life. We're just gonna look at him and say, "Yeah, same here." He then tells us next time we come here, lunch or dinners are on him. Today I was scheduled to receive a package, but I had to be out of the house today. Around 1 p.m. I get an alert from my Ring doorbell and see my neighbor taking the package from my steps. Now, I have never done more than exchange pleasantries, but I assumed she was trying to be polite and keep it from being stolen. Around 45 minutes later, I returned home and went over to collect my package. I politely asked her for it and she claimed to have no knowledge of it. I truthfully couldn't believe my ears and asked again, and the entitled neighbor denied it again. So I had to show her the video of her clearly taking it. And how does she react?
"How dare you record me without my consent? I am calling my lawyer."
Then she slams the door in my face. At this point, I was furious and knocked on her door again, not so nicely, and she didn't answer. I went home to put the file on a flash drive and planned to report her when there was a knock on my door. The cops. Now, I live in a pretty nice suburb, but I was still amazed the police got there within 20 minutes of that second knock. The entitled neighbor had called 911 saying that I had been recording her and was beating down her door. It only took a few minutes for the officer in question to get to the bottom of what was going on. The entitled woman had the nerve to rant and rave that she had been recorded without permission to the officer as she was arrested. Her husband returned the item and she had opened it and wrapped it to re-gift. He tried to get me to drop the charges, but I'm going to let it play out in court. I haven't seen her return home, so maybe she's still in a cell, telling everyone how she was recorded without consent. Update: a few things have happened. The block captain with the neighborhood watch came by and asked some questions. Turns out that there have been a lot of such thefts in our neighborhood. The woman in question has been suspected in at least one of them, but no one has ever had any proof. We got one of the lock boxes for packages just to keep me safe. Lastly, it was an American Girl doll. So many people have asked. This happened a few years ago to my sister and her friend. When they were at school, they were always approached by a girl every day. Let's call her Rosie. Rosie would continue to pester and harass my sister and her friend until one day my sister pushed her down into the park in the playground. Rosie ran off and my sister thought that was the end of it. Boy, was she wrong. While they were walking home down a main road, they were stopped by a car. Inside the car was Rosie and her raging father. He was blaming my sister and her friend for bullying his daughter. My sister and her friend, only being 11 at the time and scared of confrontations, ran across the road into a side street where her friend lived. But Rosie's father wasn't done yet. He flew down the main road and pretty much drifted his car up the side street and in front of the friend's house. He hung himself out his car shouting at them, saying that, "I'm going to kick your head in," and "I'm going to kill you both." He was shouting that to 11-year-olds. My sister called both me and my dad, as I was closer, and 14 at the time I couldn't drive. So I ran down the road and while calling the police. However, a bystander came over and defended my sister and her friend. The raging father didn't shout at the bystander, but got angry and drove off. Both me, my dad, and the police arrived simultaneously. They took statements and found out his name and a court date was set up. My dad passed him a few days later in his car, and it turns out he shaved his beard because he didn't want to be recognized in court. During the hearing, he managed to screw himself over. The judge was in his favor until the bystander who talked to him earlier went up on the podium. She said exactly what happened. His reply was, "Yes, exactly. I didn't shout at you." His lawyer shook his head as if to say, "Oh, come on. You're ruining things for yourself here." The judge turns to him and says, "So you admit you were there?" And he goes silent. Turns out he was given a criminal record and 6 months jail time. He was around his early 30s. When the police came to our door, they said he would have a hard time finding a job in the future. I grinned so hard. So some quick backstory to this. I don't live with an HOA, but I have had dealings with them. I studied environmental engineering in college and have a degree with a specialization in water treatment systems. Normally though, that's not my day job. Even so, recently a friend of mine who works with one of the neighboring cities asked me if I wouldn't mind doing some tests for water pollution in a waterfowl preservation area. There have been some strange die-off events going on, and the city was trying to figure out where the source of the pollution was coming from. I'll be operating under a special contract from the city. I was given access to any location along this waterfowl area, within reason, to perform my tests, of course. I won't go into detail about how the tests work. They are involved and can be a pain, but suffice it to say that I started taking water and soil samples from likely sources along the waterfowl preserve's borders. This showed me that there was a notable amount of nitrates and phosphates in the water, which I surmised was affecting the birds. Now, to find the source. I followed the river up its length, passing a number of housing sites, a couple of apartments and the odd settling pond. Over the course of several weeks and barrage of tests, these were ruled out as sources. The further I went up the river though, the stronger the concentrations became, to the point that it was dangerous for humans to even be in contact with the water. We're talking about super fun type pollution here. This was last summer. As I waded up along this area, I heard some splashing and the sounds of kids playing in the water. Not good at all. Turning the bend, I come face to face with a small dock leading into the water, and 4 or 5 kids taking turns jumping off it into the water. The heavily polluted, dangerous water. There is some lady sitting on the dock watching them, and I approached her. I forgot the exchange, but it boiled down to me telling her that I'm from the city, and based on some of what had been found, the children were banned from swimming in the river. The lady tried arguing the point until I told her I was calling the marshal, code enforcement, to have the area barricaded off, and she could explain her complaints to him. She grabbed the kids and scuttled off. Marshal did arrive, found that the dock wasn't built with proper code standards, and condemned it, forcing the HOA who had built it to have it demolished within a week, or the city was going to do it and they would front the bill. That still left the matter of the pollution. That's where things got weird though. Once I passed this HOA subdivision, all pollution vanished. I must have done 5 or 6 further tests to verify this, but yeah, no pollution. So I had my culprit. The next question was figuring out what they were doing, and that's where my investigative side comes in. With the help of the marshal, I started going around the properties of the HOA, talking with residents. It was a few simple questions like, do you know if they are fertilizing the grass? And when do they do this? And do you know the type of fertilizer they use? Just gathering evidence. Remember the lady from before? Turned out she was the HOA president. I only found this out after she called the police on the marshal and I, reporting strange men wandering around her neighborhood. She called him something like 4 times in a day before the police flat out told her they work with the city, and if you keep calling, we're charging you. That didn't stop her from following us around in her car and taking photos with her phone. Eventually, we spoke with one older gentleman that broke the case, as it were. The HOA president had been fining people for not having perfectly green grass. We were in a drought at the time, so that's no surprise there. After several of the people in the subdivision got fined by the city for watering their grass, she had taken matters into her own hands. She'd first tried contracting a landscaper to spray the lawns with fertilizer, but due to various EPA regulations, he'd apparently refused. The homeowner couldn't be certain what the lady had done next, but a couple days after that, some guys turned up with a large farm-type trailer of liquid and sprayed every single foot of grass the HOA controlled, even right down to the water's edge. With the homeowner's permission, I took several soil samples from around his property, and then samples from the common area that joined the grassy area beside the river and the dock. It took about a week to get full results back, but I had my answer. This lady had some contractors or someone spraying farm-grade fertilizer on the grass. This particular fertilizer is heavily controlled by the EPA and requires a special license to even possess, much less use. I presented all my evidence to my contact at the city and laid out just how serious the damage was, and that I was legally obligated to report the HOA to the State Regulatory Board for gross violations. My contract took the papers and paid me for my services, thanking me but also noting that if this went to court, I would need to testify about my findings. The epilogue. The court was originally scheduled for March of 2020, but it never came to that. The HOA president entered a plea deal with the state, where she and the HOA was required to pay for the environmental cleanup of the river, as well as restitution to the state. The fines alone topped close to $250,000, and the cleanup, still ongoing, is expected to break $1 million itself. The HOA president got the boot, while the HOA itself was, last I heard, facing being dissolved by the state due to multiple cases of negligence and inept management. I don't know how they came in contact with that fertilizer, though I suspect some of the charges against the HOA president had something to do with that. Want to know the sad thing though? If the HOA had simply contacted the city or the state, they would have been given a list of approved fertilizers to use, which both wouldn't have polluted the surrounding water and wouldn't have put them on the hook for an environmental disaster. The number is right on the city and state's website. The HOA just couldn't be bothered to look it up. My wife and I closed on our house in March of 2020 and did a cross-country move to Nevada to move into our house late March 2020, right at the onset of COVID. For your information, during the closing period, I read every document for disclosure of the HOA before agreeing to the close on the house. After we moved in, the HOA would move meetings through email communications only, even though notice via USPS was required. Meetings were cancelled because of COVID, social media was on fire, and the president of the board was known for verbal abuse. To this day, no one has a nice thing to say about the board. This HOA has a really bad reputation for overstepping and being hypercritical. In the spring, they have a person with no landscaping knowledge or experience write up violations against homeowners for landscaping issues that turn out to be dormant plants. Want to replace a dying tree? Good luck! Their experts state that the writing on the box for a tree has to say X gallons, and the mentions on the box are not sufficient. 3 different people asking the same questions over and over for information that are in design review applications. One of the things that irritated me was a board member that was speaking about homeowners following the rules in reference to violations. Well, there are not many rules for them homeowners to follow. In January 2021, there was an accident between the HOA security company that is hired to protect the common areas of the HOA only and some homeowners. I started asking questions about how the security company hired/selected by asking for meeting minutes and audio records of all of the meetings. It took me 6 months of obtaining the audios, listening to them, making notes, asking for missing meeting minutes, financial documents, and so on. I attended a board meeting in April 2021 and spoke out in the homeowner section about how the board had violated the statutes. They were basically yelling at me for calling them out. Magically, the audio of this meeting is not available. I discovered a significant problem about how the security vendor was selected, how the board was not being transparent with vendor selection, holding secret meetings, and the like. I wrote and delivered a number of notice of violations to 3 different board members via certified mail. I am requiring each board member to undertake to write and put policy in place to right the wrongs, establish a policy for vendor selection, and so on. Additionally, I require them to add the violations to the upcoming board meeting in August. I'm prepared to take the issue to the real estate division and court if necessary. Thank you for watching and see you next time.